It's fall, and if you're like us, you're already trying to figure out ways that you can amend your soil to make your spring planting and growth even better. There's a couple of ways to do that. One is through standard composting with a composter. The other is through vermicomposting. We're going to share with you a little bit about both and which one we like better. Stick around. Hey guys, welcome back to our channel, The Purpose Driven Homestead. Now, if you're like us, you're probably already starting to get your head wrapped around what do I need to do to try to make my soil, try to make it better, amend it, do what I can to help it during the fall and the winter so that I can get an even stronger and more productive crop in the spring. Now, if that's you, I've got a couple of ideas for you today. I want to compare. Now, we did a video a while back. I'll actually link it in the description below. I'm also going to put a card at the top up here. Go back and watch that video on how we created a vermicompost tower, which is a worm tower for those of you who don't know. It was one of our very first videos, but it's actually one that we really liked. We've used that worm tower extensively. Now, we even moved it with us. Now, I do have a few things that I changed about it, and I'm going to show just a little clip. The biggest thing is that I made the holes bigger. Now I probably would have used a 6-inch pipe if I would have had a 6-inch pipe, but we used 4-inch and that works perfectly fine. But if you have a spare piece of 6-inch pipe, that just makes it even easier because it allows you to put more into it. But the idea is that a vermicomposting or a worm tower allows the food scraps to go in, and then they're able to get into the bottom, and there's holes drilled in that PVC pipe so that the worms can come in and out and they can digest that food, those food scraps, and they can use that to make basically an amended soil for you. It's basically composting in the ground. Now that's different from regular composting. Regular composting is where you get some type of composter, either one that is a tumbler or one that sits on the ground. I highly recommend the tumbler in this case just because I think it works a lot faster, but they both have merits and they both have drawbacks. I'm going to share with you a little bit today about some of those things. Now, like I mentioned, we made a DIY worm tower before. Again, watch this video and then go back and watch that one. I've linked it all. Now that brings us to our first point. The worm tower is a DIY exercise. You can actually do that 100% yourself, and if you've got a spare piece of 4-inch PVC pipe laying around, you can make that at virtually zero cost to you. That is pretty cheap. That's compared to some composters. Now, we do have a tumbler composter, but some of those composters can cost anywhere around $100 to $200 depending on the size that you get. I do think there's a lot of value in them, and I'm going to put a link in our description below on the one that we have. They actually don't make the one that we have anymore. They make a slightly smaller size. I like the size of ours because I think it's really big, and if you have a decent sized family, they're nice for that. But there's a couple of reasons you might want to get that, and there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do the vermicomposting. And again, we're going to draw that comparison, but the first thing is cost, and in that particular thing, the check mark goes to the DIY worm tower. It's a whole lot cheaper. You're able to do that at virtually no cost. And again, that's compared to a couple $100 you're going to probably spend on a composter, probably at least $100 even on a small version. So step one, that win goes to the vermicomposter or the worm tower. Now the next point may be something that seems a little obvious, but I want to illustrate a point by saying it. The worm tower encourages worm activity. Now we've been all over this farm and we have seen a lot of crickets, we've seen a lot of bugs, we've seen a lot of insects of all kinds of different, moths and grasshoppers and this and that and the other. But the one thing we haven't seen nearly as much of as we did in the Midwest is earthworm activity. Now, earthworm activity is a clear sign of the health of your soil. Now, if you don't have a lot of earthworms, that's something that you need to work on because that is a measurement of soil health. The worms move under the soil in that top layer, the first 10 or so inches of soil, and they make holes. And as they move through, they aerate the soil naturally. They make room for the roots of the plants to then grow into that space. And they don't just do it once, right? They're constantly moving every single night. Go outside after a rain at nighttime and walk through your yard. If you see a bunch of worms, that's a pretty good sign because that means that they're actively working in your garden, they're actively working in your soil. And so that's something that we want to reiterate here. Worms are good for your soil and they're great for your garden. So in that capacity, the worm composter or that worm tower, it allows you to put food in the top, and what you do is when you put the food in the top, the worms are drawn to it, they're already in the soil working around it, they're pulling it in and they're taking the nutrients and they're moving it out to all of the plants that are in that area. The composter doesn't do that. Now, sure, you can take your composter and you can apply it wherever you want. So there's a slightly different benefit, but you still have to go and put that wherever you want it, whereas this does not encourage worm activity. The worms aren't crawling up into your composter, so it's going to take longer to decompose that stuff in your composter than it would if you put it in your worm tower, because the worms are eating it actively. It's not just rotting, but those worms are actively eating it, and then they're moving it through that soil. So that's that second point that I wanted to make, is that it encourages worm activity. So check mark to the worm tower. So that's 2 out of the list that go to the worm tower as pros. Now the next thing on the list is rich compost, and I can tell you that this one's a tie. Both of these create very, very good compost, and they do it in different ways. Again, the composting bin really does it over time. It does it more in a way that allows time to take care of this. You're gonna have some insect activity in there as well, but it's gonna take heat, which most of these are black, and so they soak up the sun, right? They don't reflect any of that sun back. So they're gonna add heat to it, and they're gonna compost, and they produce a very rich soil. The worm tower is going to look a little different because you're not going to necessarily see the soil it's creating, because it's going to be moving with the worms. As they eat and they move back out into the soil, they're taking some of that compost with them, and they're distributing it all along their path as they crawl. So this is a tie. Both of them produce great compost, and they're both really, really rich. Now the next one on our list is actually going to be a win for the composting bin. The thing is, the composting bin allows you to do something very unique. It allows you to raise soldier fly larvae. Now that's not something that you probably expected me to say, but in the composting bin, you can actually raise soldier fly larvae. Now, you can actually design one of these, and you can do a DIY compost bin that's not a rotating one. Those aren't as good, but you can focus in on harvesting those soldier fly larvae, and that can become food for your chickens. That's not really something that you can do with a worm tower. Now, in all good conscience, you can, in fact, harvest the worms. And chickens love worms as well, but I think the soldier fly larvae is an easier, more productive way of doing that. So that win I'm going to give to the composting bin. We often have soldier fly larvae that are crawling out of ours that we just harvest, or they fall on the ground. You can collect those, or you can actually make a collection system that does that for you, kind of an automatic. They crawl up, then they fall through, and they get collected into a bucket. There's actually a couple of really cool videos out on YouTube about that, so I won't try to talk any more about that, but that's something you should look into, because it's a really cool process, and that can only be done in a composting bin. Now, it should not be underestimated. One of the things on our list is the ease of an ability to move. These things need to be moved around. Especially if you're using a worm composter, you're gonna wanna move this thing around from time to time. And with your regular composter, there's gonna be times that you may not want it where it was originally. You may wanna move it to mow around it or behind it. I mean, these are stationary. They're pretty big items that sit there. And so they get heavy when they get full of compost. So one of the things that you wanna figure out is, how easy is it to move? Well, I can tell you, first of all, that big composting bin, not easy to move. It takes a lot of force. I'm a pretty big guy. It takes a lot to drag that thing. It weighs, probably right now, it's only about half full, and it probably weighs close to 100 pounds. So I'm dragging this 100-pound composter around when I wanna mow, when I wanna get around it, which isn't all that useful. So unless you're gonna find a spot that you want that all the time, that's a drawback of using a drum-based composter, or even just a ground-based composter. Now, if you found a spot that you wanna leave it for the rest of your life, then fine. But I wanna make sure that we move ours. Now, when it comes to the worm composting tower, pretty easy to move around. This doesn't take any effort at all. We're able to take this and move it around. We can even use several of them and position them in different places. Then a few weeks later, or a month or two later, we can position it again in a different place. And now all those rich things are in the soil. We cover it back up, we move it to the next spot, and it's like it was never even there. All right, the next thing on my list is probably gonna sound a little petty, but hear me out. If you don't want to dig a hole, that's a clear win for the composting bin. To use a worm tower, you gotta dig a hole. And if you're like, I can't dig a hole, I don't wanna be bothered with it, that's such a hassle, that's just too much, I don't have a post hole digger, I don't have a shovel, whatever your excuse is, if you don't wanna dig a hole, you're gonna need to go with some kind of composting bin. That's just the way it is. Enough said.
Enough said.
The next two on my list I'm going to cover in rapid succession because they're related but not the same thing. So I decided to compare, can you put normal food waste in both of these systems? The answer is yes, so that's a tie. You can absolutely put things like banana peels, things like asparagus or bell peppers or anything that you get out of your garden that's small like that, maybe that you would eat at your table and have scraps and stuff left over, lettuce parts, just anything like that, parts of tomatoes, all of that can go in both of these systems and it's not going to cause any problems. Now the flip side of that particular coin is yard waste. Now that could be whether it's paper bags from your local grocery store that they give you instead of plastic, or it could simply be some weeds out of your garden. Now some people are going to tell you not to compost weeds. If you're a purist, you're probably like, don't do that, you're going to get seeds all in it. That's probably true. However, we often leave our stuff in there for months and months, if not even a year, in our big compost bin. So a lot of times all that rots out. So I've really never had any problems with that. But if you're a purist, close your ears for a second, but you can put yard waste, you can put leaves, you can put grass clippings. If you don't have a huge yard, you can put a lot of that in your composter and it will digest that over time and it'll become great compost. And you cannot do that with this tube composter or the worm tower. It won't fit in there, it'll clog it up, and it's just not something that you can do. So that's a clear win for the tumbler or the large system composters over the vermicompost tower or the worm tower. Now is a fantastic time to remind you that if you're enjoying this content, if you like what we do and you like the things that you're seeing, subscribe to our channel. Helps us out a ton. Also click that like button. It tells the algorithm that this is something that other people may want to watch as well. Finally, make sure you click the notification bell. That is the thing that alerts you that we have just produced another video. We're trying to release a ton of content now that we're on our new little homestead, and that's the only way that you're going to be able to keep up with it. All right, now back to the video. Now this next thing is something I really want to put a lot of emphasis on, even if I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. And that is, with a worm tower, you let the worms do all the work. The worms are doing everything for you. You dump the food in the top and then the worms come in. The regular composting happens, right? That's just going to happen. It's going to break down its own, but the worms come in and they eat that and then they take that food out. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to underscore it here. They're taking that and they're distributing it through these tunnel systems that they make as they make their way through the dirt, and they're distributing those nutrients everywhere all along the waste. And they're, by the fact that they're digesting it, that means it's already in a more usable format for the plants even before any of this starts. So that makes it a win in my book. With a composter, on the other hand, you're going to have to do something with that. That compost is sitting in there and then it's ready. You're going to need to do something with that compost. That means coming, putting it into a wheelbarrow, and then wheelbarrowing it out and shoveling it out where you want it. And maybe that's fine for you. But for us, it seems so much more efficient to let the worms do what they do by putting our worm towers in periodic places throughout our garden and letting them do all the work for us. We are a big fan of the model where we have animals and insects do things for us so that we don't have to do it ourselves. Now this next item on the list, I think you're going to get a chuckle out of, but if I have any preppers or kind of what I call closet homesteaders, those are those people who live in an urban or suburban environment and they truly want a homestead, but they just can't based off the space they're in. So they do little things like we've tried to teach you guys how to do, things like using quail instead of chickens that are super quiet and super small. There are certain things that I call our closet homesteader team. You know, those are the things that people are looking for. So if that's you, if either you are living in a very small space, you're kind of a closet homesteader, or simply you live in a HOA or some place where you can't do a lot of these things, this next one is really important. And the reason I say that is because this composter is an eyesore. In so many ways, it is so hard to conceal this thing. It sticks out. You can try to hide it behind a building or put it behind an out parcel, but it tends to be kind of something that sticks out. It's pretty large, and so because of that, it's hard to hide it. It's hard to make it look like it blends into anything out there. Now, that's not the case with the worm composter. The worm composter is easy to conceal. If you paint it the same color as your house, it'll actually blend in from the road. You could put it in your front yard, in your garden, in the space where you keep maybe your flowers or your shrubbery or whatever, and if you wanted to use it there, there's actually no way you'd be able to see it easily from the road if you paint it the same color as your house. It looks like it blends in. It looks very similar to just normal pieces of PVC that might be a drain pipe that's needed or required by code. So this thing blends really well in with everything that you've got going on, and it's easily concealed. Not that way with the big, bulky composter. So that's another win for the worm tower. If you're keeping score at home, you can probably already tell that the worm tower is way out in front. But I'm going to give you a couple of bonus items now that I thought were valuable. They're not really big items, but I do think they'll help you make a choice as you're trying to decide between these two. The first of which is the smell component. Now, I think the worm composter has absolutely no smell at all. In a lot of ways, you wouldn't even know it's there because everything is sitting below the surface. And so because of that, everything's dissolving, it's being taken back into the earth. It's not creating any smell at all. The composting bin, however, does sometimes take on a bad odor. If it gets too wet or the pH gets off, it can get a very swampy smell or even a rotten smell. And that's not something that you want if you have neighbors nearby. And it does tend to cause things to stink around there. So that's something you should be aware of, especially if it's getting full and it has a big cycle to go through, especially if it's got a lot of green stuff in it. That's just not something you want at all. That smell is definitely a drawback. The bonus item that's in favor of the composting bin is this. You could put eggshells into that with no problem. With the worm tower, I don't encourage you to put eggshells in that, but you do want to put them in your garden. It's good for your garden. That calcium's always good. It breaks down over time, but it can clog up that. And also, worms don't particularly care for eggshells. They're pretty sharp on the edges and they can cut them a little bit, and so they tend to avoid them, even though they do secrete like a slime to move around on, almost like slugs, but not quite. It is something that they tend to avoid eggshells if they can. So putting them in there would discourage the worm growth, which is the thing you're not wanting to do. So putting eggshells into a regular big composting bin is actually the way to go if you want to do that. I hope you've enjoyed the video today, and I'd hope you have learned a little bit about worm composting versus in a worm tower versus doing regular composting in a composter. There's obviously a lot of similarities, but there's some reasons you might want to choose one over the other. Also, if you've liked today's video, please subscribe to our channel. Also, give this video a thumbs up. It helps us grow more than you can imagine. Also, if you've really liked this video today, think about giving us a super thanks below. It's just a little way to help out the channel. It's a very small donation that can help us buy camera equipment and things like that we need to continue to making videos like this in the future. Also, if you wanted to find out more about how we made our worm tower, I've got that video linked in the description below if you want to check that out, just to get an idea of how to do it yourself, because it's really, really easy. Guys, thank you so much. We hope you have a blessed day, and we'll see you next time on the Purpose-Driven Homestead. All right, the next thing on my list is going to maybe sound a little petty. All right, hush ducks. I'm trying to tape something here. I got the dogs over here barking at me on one side. The ducks are over there barking or quacking on the other side. Trying to record a video here these days is so complicated. Yes, I will love on you in just a couple of minutes, okay?